Do you have any idea how much money I give to this place? If I want these people out of my way, you move them, or I'll buy this whole hospital just to fire you myself.
Tessa was the kind of nurse everyone loved. She worked hard, stayed late, and was always calm, even though she was 7 months pregnant and her back always ached. Her coworkers thought she was just a nice, quiet woman who wanted a simple life. She never talked about her family or where she came from because she wanted to stay away from the scary world she grew up in. Nobody knew that this quiet nurse was actually the sister of Min Jun, the most dangerous mafia boss in the city. Min Jun let her live her own life because he knew she wanted peace. But that peace didn't last long. When a rich, arrogant guy named Marcus Reed walked into her ward, everything changed. He thought he was just picking on a nobody, but he had no idea he was about to lose everything. Welcome to Korean Syndicate Chronicles. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. Now let's get into it. The city hospital was always loud, but inside the ICU, things felt different. The air was thick with the smell of bleach and the steady beep 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 of heart monitors that never seemed to stop. Tessa moved through the hallways with a slow, careful step. At 7 months pregnant, her back was constantly aching, and her feet felt twice their normal size, but she didn't let it show. She just tightened the strings on her blue scrubs and kept going. To everyone else on the floor, Tessa was the nurse you wanted by your side when things went wrong. She was the calm center of the storm, always ready with a gentle word for a scared family or a steady hand for a patient in pain. Her coworkers often wondered why someone as talented as Tessa didn't want a fancy job in a private clinic. They saw a hard-working, humble woman who lived a simple life. They didn't know that Tessa was actually hiding in plain sight. Every time she checked in for a bag or updated a chart, she was choosing this sterile, predictable world over the dangerous one she had left behind. She grew up in the shadows of the city's underground, raised as the adoptive sister of Min Jun. In the streets, people didn't even dare to whisper his name. He was Korea's most dangerous man, a boss who ruled with an iron fist. Tessa loved her brother, but she hated his world. Years ago, she had sat him down and told him she wanted out. She wanted to heal people, not live around violence. Min Jun, who usually never listened to anyone, honored her wish. He let her go, but he never truly let her out of his sight. He had built an untouchable empire, yet he made sure she stayed shielded from the dark side of his power. As Tessa finished her rounds, she stopped for a second to rub her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick against her hand. She felt safe here. She thought she had finally built the normal life she always dreamed of. She had a job she loved and a little apartment of her own. She really believed she had escaped the drama of the high-stakes underworld forever. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, a man with too much money and zero respect was going to walk through those double doors and ruin everything. She was about to find out that even though she had left the Mafia had never truly left her. For now, though, she just took a deep breath, adjusted her lab coat, and stepped out into the hall, ready for the next patient. Tessa was just finishing up with a patient when the heavy double doors of the ICU burst open with a loud bang. A tall man in an expensive dark suit, Marcus Reed, stormed in like he owned the place, looking absolutely furious. Behind him, a stressed-out assistant was holding a tiny piece of tissue over a small scratch on Marcus's hand. Even though the ICU was full of people fighting for their lives, Marcus started shouting for a doctor, claiming he had a splitting headache and needed a private trauma room immediately because he was the hospital's biggest donor. A young doctor tried to explain that every bed was taken by people in critical condition, but Marcus just shoved him aside and barked that he'd buy the whole hospital and fire everyone if he didn't get his way. Tessa knew she had to step in before things got worse, so she stood right in his path, blocking the door to a patient who had just come out of heart surgery. With a calm but firm voice, she told him that this was a place for life-or-death emergencies, and that he would have to wait in the lobby like everyone else for a minor scratch. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his face turning bright red as he leaned in close enough for Tessa to smell his expensive cologne. He pulled out his thick leather wallet and offered to pay whatever it took to bump a nobody out of a bed, but Tessa didn't blink. She told him to put his money away because wealth doesn't buy a place in line when human lives are at stake. Marcus looked like he was about to explode. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially from a nurse he thought was completely beneath him. The air in the hallway felt like it was about to snap as Marcus Reed stared Tessa down, his eyes dark with a nasty kind of pride. He looked at her bulging stomach and then at the cup of steaming black coffee in his hand, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Without saying a word, he tilted his hand and poured the scalding liquid right onto Tessa's pregnant belly. Tessa let out a sharp cry of pain and shock, stumbling back as the heat soaked through her blue scrubs, her hands instinctively flying up to protect her baby. Everyone in the hall froze. Nurses, patients, and even the security guards just stood there with their mouths open, unable to believe a grown man could be so heartless. Just then, Dr. Miller, the hospital chief, came rushing around the corner. But instead of checking on his injured, pregnant employee, he ran straight to Marcus, apologizing profusely and asking if the billionaire was disturbed by the encounter. Tessa stood there trembling, her skin stinging and her eyes filling with tears, only for Dr. Miller to turn on her with a face full of fake outrage. He didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, he shouted that her disrespectful attitude toward a valued donor was a disgrace to the hospital. Right there in front of the man who had just assaulted her, Miller told Tessa she was fired and ordered security to escort her out of the building like a common criminal. Marcus just stood back, adjusting his expensive cuffs and looking at Tessa like she was a piece of trash he'd finally cleared off his shoe, completely unaware that he had just started a war he could never win. Tessa's nightmare didn't end when she walked out of the hospital doors. It was actually just beginning. By the time she reached the parking lot, the sky had turned a bruised purple and a cold, heavy rain began to pour, soaking through her coffee-stained scrubs. She tried to use her phone to call a ride, but a message popped up saying her cellular service had been disconnected. Shaking with a mix of cold and fear, she hurried to a nearby ATM to get some cash, but when she slid her card in, the screen flashed a bright red, account frozen notice. Marcus Reed hadn't just humiliated her. He was systematically erasing her life. He had used his massive influence to call her bank and her service providers, making sure she couldn't move an inch. When she finally made it back to her small apartment, exhausted and shivering, she found two burly men in suits standing outside her door with her few belongings already packed into soggy cardboard boxes on the sidewalk. They didn't even look her in the eye as they told her that the building's owner had sold his interest to a Reed subsidiary and her lease was terminated effective immediately for unprofessional conduct, reported by the hospital. Tessa stood there on the pavement, clutching her pregnant belly as the rain washed away her tears, realizing she had no money, no job, and no home. Marcus wanted her to feel like a powerless nobody, small enough to be crushed under his heel. He thought he had successfully isolated her, but as she reached into the hidden lining of her bag to pull out the one phone he didn't know about, she knew he had made a fatal mistake. He had taken everything she worked for, and now, she had absolutely nothing left to lose by calling the one person she had spent years trying to avoid. Tessa sat on a cold bus stop bench, the rain still soaking through her clothes, feeling the heavy weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had tried to play by the rules her whole life, believing that if you were good and worked hard, the world would treat you fairly. But Marcus Reed had just shown her that his money could buy the truth and crush the innocent. She looked down at her shaking hands and then at her belly, feeling a sharp pang of protective instinct that outweighed her own pride. She knew she couldn't win a fair fight against a billionaire who owned the banks and the bosses, so she reached deep into the hidden pocket of her bag and pulled out a small, old-fashioned flip phone she hadn't touched in years. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she flipped it open. The screen glowed with a single, saved number. For a second, she hesitated, remembering why she had walked away from that life. But then she thought of the scalding coffee and the way she'd been tossed out like trash. She pressed the call button, and it didn't even ring twice before a deep, cold voice answered on the other end, simply saying, "Tessa?" Hearing her brother Min Jun's voice made the tears finally spill over, and all she could manage to choke out was that she was in trouble and she was scared. There was a long, chilling silence on the line, the kind of silence that usually meant someone's world was about to end, and then Min Jun spoke in a tone so calm it was terrifying, telling her to stay exactly where she was because he was already on his way. Tessa closed the phone, finally feeling a sense of relief. knowing that while she had spent years trying to be a nurse and a healer, she had just unleashed a monster that Marcus Reed was nowhere near prepared to handle. Less than 10 minutes after Tessa hung up the phone, the world around Marcus Reed began to quietly catch fire. While Marcus was sitting in a high-end steakhouse, bragging to his friends about putting a peasant in her place, Min Jun was sitting in a dark, silent office, surrounded by glowing screens and men who moved like ghosts. Min Jun didn't scream or throw things. He just gave a small, cold nod to his lead tech specialist, and the scorched earth policy began. In an instant, the Mafia's hackers tore through Marcus's digital life like a chainsaw through paper. It started with his personal phone going dead, followed by his private emails being leaked to every major news outlet in the country, showing years of tax evasion, offshore accounts, and dirty deals. At the same time, Min Jun's financial team began shorting Marcus's company stock, dumping millions of shares so fast that the price plummeted toward zero before the board of directors could even pick up the phone. Marcus's black credit cards, the ones that were supposed to have no limit, were declined right at the dinner table, leaving him red-faced as the waiter took away his bottle of vintage wine. Every security system at his mansion was remotely overridden, locking his own guards out and turning his smart home into a high-tech cage. Min Jun watched the chaos unfold on his monitors with a stern, unreadable expression, his sharp gray suit perfectly pressed as he adjusted his cuffs. He wasn't just taking Marcus's money. He was erasing his name, his reputation, and his safety. By the time the sun started to go down, Marcus Reed went from being one of the most powerful men in the city to a man who couldn't even buy a candy bar, and he still had no idea that a quiet nurse's brother was the one pulling the strings. By the time Marcus stumbled out of the restaurant, his entire world was crumbling faster than he could keep track of. He kept hitting the refresh button on his banking app, but the numbers just kept spinning until they hit a solid, terrifying zero. On the giant digital billboards overlooking the city square, the news was already flashing his face alongside headlines about a massive federal investigation into his business deals. His stock had plummeted so hard that the market had to stop trading it entirely, and just like that, billions of dollars simply evaporated into thin air. When he finally reached his sprawling mansion, the massive iron gates didn't open. He had to climb over them like a common intruder. He found his elite security team throwing their badges on the ground and walking away, telling him they didn't work for bankrupt criminals. As he stepped onto his front porch, the high-tech lights flickered once, twice, and then the entire estate went pitch black as the power was cut. He stood there in the heavy silence, shivering in the same rain that had soaked Tessa just hours before. The man who had bragged about buying people's careers was now standing in the dark, unable to even unlock his own front door. He was starting to realize that his money wasn't a shield at all. It was just paper, and someone much more powerful had just set it all on fire. For the first time in his life, Marcus Reed was truly alone, and he was absolutely terrified of what was coming next out of the shadows. Before Marcus could even process that he was homeless, two men in sharp suits appeared out of the shadows and forced him into the back of a black sedan, whisking him away to a skyscraper he used to own. He was pushed into his own former boardroom, but the seat at the head of the table was already taken by Min Jun, who sat there looking like a king from a different world. The room was freezing, and the only sound was the clicking of a pen as Min Jun slid a thick stack of papers across the mahogany table. Marcus tried to bark out a threat about his lawyers, but Min Jun just looked at him with those cold, unreadable eyes and turned a laptop around, showing a live stream of every illegal bribe and offshore deal Marcus had ever made being sent directly to the FBI. The billionaire's face went pale as he realized he wasn't looking at a businessman, but a man who operated far outside the law. Min Jun didn't raise his voice. He just calmly told Marcus that he had two choices: sign the papers confessing to everything and hand over his remaining hidden assets to a charity for single mothers, or walk out the door and deal with the unfortunate accidents the Mafia was famous for. Shaking like a leaf and realizing his money was gone and his power was a joke, Marcus grabbed the pen and scribbled his name on every page. He had spent his life thinking he was a god because of his bank account, but sitting across from the man whose sister he had dared to touch, he finally understood that true power isn't about how much you can buy. It's about who you shouldn't have messed with. A few weeks later, the hospital was a completely different place. And it wasn't just because Min Jun's company had officially bought the entire building. Tessa was resting in a luxury private suite, the kind with soft lighting and a view of the city, holding her healthy newborn baby in her arms. She looked down at the tiny sleeping face and finally felt the peace she had been searching for, knowing she'd never have to look over her shoulder again. Downstairs in the lobby, the hospital chief who had fired her was now wearing a stained janitor's uniform, silently mopping the floors and avoiding everyone's gaze in total shame. While Tessa was surrounded by flowers and the quiet protection of her brother's men, Marcus Reed was experiencing a much harsher reality. The former billionaire was being pushed into a tiny, cold federal prison cell, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a finality that signaled the end of his life of luxury. He had no money, no friends, and no one to scream at anymore. He was just another inmate wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit. Tessa had proven that being kind and humble isn't the same thing as being weak, and as she watched the sun set from her window, she knew that the people who had tried to crush her were finally gone for good. Justice had been served, and as she held her baby close, she realized that true power wasn't about the money Marcus had lost, but about the family and the peace she had finally won back. The moral of this story is that true power isn't found in a bank account or a fancy title. It's found in how you treat people who can do nothing for you. Marcus Reed thought his billions made him untouchable, but he learned the hard way that arrogance is a trap and money is just paper when you lose your integrity. The story reminds us to never mistake a person's quiet humility for weakness. Those who choose to be kind are often the ones with the strongest spirits, and sometimes the most powerful protection. In the end, respect is earned through character, and those who prey on the vulnerable will eventually find themselves facing a storm they cannot buy their way out of. If you enjoyed seeing ultimate justice served today, please hit that like button. We want to hear from you. What did you think of Marcus's punishment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next tale of karma and consequences in the Korean Mafia world. Thanks for watching.